This conference will now be recorded.
I'm talking today to Sebastian Elwell, Director at Switchfoot Wealth Limited in Farnham. Thanks for taking the time to speak to me today, Sebastian. I suppose with this being the later life events, probably the best question to start with is what you personally define as later life advice, because it will vary depending on the types of clients you tend to deal with.
Sure, I take quite a holistic description of later life. It's if you're looking at that planning timeline, perhaps on Voyant or something like that, it's pretty much anything that is over on the right-hand quarter. So it will encompass everything from inheritance tax planning, retirement income, of the obvious sort of care scenarios, maybe downsizing your home. But it could also cover off sort of things that you might not think of. So pensions, for example, for grandchildren, pensions for babies. So actually, I probably wrote more pensions via my later life clients than I did for my younger ones, because I have one client who has, I think, 5 grandchildren and goodness knows how many great grandchildren now, and they wanted to gift £2,880 out of their surplus income into each of their grandchildren's pension plans. So that's sort of the intergenerational planning element of it. And I guess it can also start quite a lot earlier. If you're looking at that timeline, you might have somebody in their 60s who's thinking about inheritance tax planning, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking, do I have enough money? What if I need care? And the ability to talk to younger clients from a very knowledgeable situation about later life. And actually, let's just talk through that scenario and what would happen and how would we deal with it, can give them the confidence to move forwards, where otherwise they might have said, actually, I'm just going to sit on this money that I don't really need for another 10 years, by which time the clock is starting to run down. We all know inheritance tax planning is cheaper if you start earlier. And I think this is an important one for people who are thinking about where they want to live. They have their dream house, and when you first ask the question, we're going to move into this beautiful property and it's going to be everything that we wanted, and we're going to stay there and we're going to die there and we're going to live there for our entire lives. And actually you say, well, is it going to be suitable? What happens if it's a bit inappropriate and you can't get care in there, or it's not got really wide doors, and getting people to think about, well, actually, would there be an extra downsize, or what would be a suitable later life property, is something that people need to think about a lot earlier than they tend to.
Yes, absolutely. Is that something you encourage? I mean, you talked there about sort of potentially downsizing. Is that something you tend to encourage in the conversation quite early on? Because as you get older, it gets more challenging, doesn't it, potentially to downsize as well?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily downsizing. It's moving to something that is more appropriate, because I think too many houses are, they're built for developers. They're not built for people with mobility issues. So you still want a nice big entertaining space. You still want to have your friends over, have that open plan kitchen, diner. You just don't need 5 bedrooms attached to it, and you don't need 3 acres of land. So thinking about, well, when do we move to something that is appropriate? And the big problem there is that we just don't build those sorts of appropriate accommodation in the country.
Yeah, they do. They probably come at a premium, don't they? Like see McCarthy and Stone and what. So so how did you come to be involved in this area of planning?
I took on a client bank now. It was 2010, so 10 years ago, and the average age of the clients were about 68.
Okay.
So we roll forwards, and the need for later life specialism, I guess, has always been there. It's always been a great comfort to the clients that they know that I can deal with it. But probably in the last few years, we're starting to see more and more cases where actually I'm having to deal with it. What we said in theory, we're now having to put into practice.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay. And what sort of further I know you've done quite a lot of sort of professional and personal development to help you advise in this space. Can you give us sort of a background of what sort of things you've done and how they helped you really?
Yeah, so I guess the first one was sort of way back in 2008. I did the CF8, which allows you to advise on care annuities, and ER1 for equity release. I don't advise on equity release, but it's important to know about it. And then more recently, I did the STEP diploma in advising vulnerable clients and SOLA, the SOLA accreditation.
Okay. And what drove you to take those?
It was just kind of natural interest for my clients. So it was one of our core values in Switchfoot is lifelong learning. So it never stops. You've always got to be doing something. And that one was just of interest, relevant to my clients, relevant to what I was trying to do in building professional connections. So just went for it. It was sort of like the natural next step.
And what was involved in the STEP diploma?
So the STEP diploma, they have 2 levels. So you can go in with a certificate, which is you can get a certificate in financial planning. I didn't do that. I submitted experience and qualifications and went straight in at the full STEP membership level.
Did you need your SOLA accreditation for that, did you?
No, the SOLA accreditation came afterwards, actually. It was
okay.
when I'd done the STEP diploma,
Yeah.
I looked at the SOLA syllabus. I went, yeah, I can go with that. So the STEP diploma was sort of, it's not mapped to QCF levels, but it is roughly equivalent of another QCF level 6 in and of its own right. And it's a very different style of learning, because although they say, well, in that they say it's multidisciplinary, it's very legal. So you are sitting legal exams and you have to memorize lots and lots of cases to back up your arguments. And you know, with PFS exams, you can count on some calculations. You know, as long as you get the maths right, you've got a good chance of hitting that exam. But with STEP, there's not so much in the way of calculations. It's just wordy and reliance on memory for lots and lots of cases, which I struggled with until I found a good memory technique.
Good, excellent. Okay. And how has that knowledge helped you? You think so practically how it has actually helped you? Is it main sort of business development, or is it around?
Yeah, so business development, I mean, first of all, you're sat in a classroom and there's going to be 1 or 2 other financial advisors at the most, and a room full of solicitors all studying the same thing. So from professional connection point of view, it's excellent. It's their exam, you're talking their language. It's a qualification that they respect and know, because they haven't had to go through our qualifications. If they did, I think they'd probably respect them quite a lot more, but they haven't had to. But they are going through STEP, they understand it, and so you're in the same boat. So it's very good from just understanding where they're coming from and building connections and aids with working holistically with the solicitors to look after clients.
Yeah. Why do you think, I mean, you mentioned there was only sort of 2 financial planners involved in the course. Why do you think that might be the case?
Pass.
No, fair enough.
Pass. I guess it's it is a different skill set. Yeah, it is a different skill set. It does zap quite a lot of your time.
Right. Okay. Are you glad you did it though?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Very much so. Very much so. But I'm glad I don't have to do it again.
I can imagine. Yeah. Okay. So how do you have your own vulnerable client policy, which I understand is sort of a condition of having your SOLA accreditation? How do you use that with clients?
So when I say it's my own, it's the slightly adaptive version of the Sense vulnerable client policy, which I think is very good. The main difference is I talk about it in my initial disclosure document.
Oh, right, okay.
So I highlight it up front with absolutely every client, whether we think they're vulnerable or not. And that's really important to have that conversation for a number of reasons. One, you don't know whether somebody is vulnerable or not. So I use the example a couple of examples. I guess vulnerability is a spectrum, isn't it? And there's as many different vulnerabilities as there are clients. So a couple of examples. I had a client who was an IT professional, and in fact, he was IT security and protecting nuclear power plants from cyber attack.
Right, okay. Yeah.
You know, not somebody you'd think of as a vulnerable client, but we had a meeting, and in that meeting, he just wasn't able to concentrate. And after a bit of asking questions, he was on some medication. He was suffering from vertigo as a result. And he wasn't able to focus on what we were talking about. And why didn't we just rebook this meeting? Oh, I didn't want to put you out. And it's well, you're not putting us out. Actually, you know, so giving people the permission to adapt your services, accommodate. Another really, really simple one. I've got a client who's colorblind, and for years I would give him charts without even thinking about it, all in reds and browns, and he couldn't see the difference between the lines. Now, it's such a simple thing when you realize just to, on FE Analytics, if you're producing a chart, just to change the color of those lines. So vulnerability covers everything from, you know, big, permanent, ongoing dementia, you know, big issues like that, through to temporary vulnerability, divorce, you know, life events, divorce, bereavement, through to things that could be very, very minor and very, very easy to solve, but are nonetheless very annoying for the client if you don't bother to solve them. So just having that conversation with everyone allows, I suppose it allows better customer service, because it gives the permission client to tell you, well, how do we need to change our service slightly to make it better for them. I've also found it a pretty good way of getting leads. So even if a client isn't vulnerable, you're talking about the policy, you say why it's important, and the client instantly starts to think of people that they know that are in that situation. It might be their parents, or, you know, they're the attorneys for, and they think, oh, actually, this would be a good advisor for them. And that can open up that conversation very naturally without sort of having to push the issues. And very, very, very common. I guess we're dealing with.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I guess we're often dealing with a sandwich generation, aren't we? With people who have got both parents, and they might be the attorneys for them, and children that they're trying to get into college and behave.
Absolutely, yeah. Have you had any sort of challenges during COVID around advising later life clients, ever getting in front of them or being able to advise them in a timely manner or anything like that? So,
yeah, it's been difficult. Many have really stepped up to the plate and engaged with video conferencing, and I guess that's been very, very useful to have that sort of cultural shift forced upon them, if you like. They would never have engaged with video conferencing before, and now they do. And we created some guides for our clients on how to use it, ones that we could print out and post, so that if it was the first time they were joining a meeting, they could see what to expect. And one of them even ended up getting so confident on it, they reformed their bridge group on Zoom. So that was quite nice. But there are some that just haven't been able to cope with it.
It's almost like a pastoral service, isn't it, you're providing there really for some clients?
Yeah, but there are some that it is just being really difficult because we cannot go and see them.
Right.
You know, they're in the shielding category, and they can't cope with technology, and they can't hear very well on the phone, and it's just, you know, you end up falling back on what delay, hoping things will come around. Then you think, no, we're going to have to end up doing a desk-based review, and that's not ideal.
Yeah. I could do with probably a copy of that video conferencing guide if I can. But I'll stop a conversation. Okay. So I understand you're also involved in the Transparency Task Force. I'd be interested to find out what that is and why you feel it's sort of needed.
Yeah, so the Transparency Task Force is a group of people that work in financial services across all sort of all aspects of financial services. You care very much about the industry, but also recognise that it's not highly trusted by the public. In fact, research shows that financial services is the least trusted of all the major industries. despite being the only one that relies entirely on trust for its entire existence. And so they think about, well, what can we do to improve the trustworthiness of the financial services industry? They've got a whole load of different projects going, and I was involved in their anti-scams special interest group, which sort of focused on pension scams. And in particular, I'm now leading an initiative with them around lasting powers of attorney and pensions. So in 2015, pensions freedom came along, and all of a sudden you can drain your entire pension pot in one fell swoop if you really want to. But there wasn't a commensurate step up in the level of protectiveness around lasting powers of attorney. So lasting powers of attorney are largely unsupervised unless you've gone to the effort of writing specific supervision clauses in there. In theory, the OPG has a mandate to investigate, but lack of transparency, how can they investigate if they're not aware and if nobody can see what's going on? So my fear is, if you imagine a cohort of people aged 65 going into drawdown in 2015, well, cognitive impairment is going to be pretty rare at 65 to 70. But if we roll on 5 years, 10 years or further, then statistically it's going to become more and more common, and there'll be more and more people potentially in drawdown contracts, which is providing highly accessible wealth with vulnerabilities, with no kind of supervision on that. And you know, at society level, that's likely to be quite dangerous. It's almost like a fire triangle, isn't it? If you combine vulnerability, accessible wealth, lack of transparency, what do we think is going to happen on a fairly large scale, or large enough to be problematic for the financial services reputation, and devastating for individuals? You know, at least with an annuity, somebody can steal your income, but you put a stop to that, you've still got an income. You know, whereas in a drawdown, you've made the incentive larger because you can go after the entire capital pot, and you've made the consequences worse. So we're collecting together a group of individuals to think about, well, what do we need to do to change the LPA regime and the pensions regime to sort of head off that risk before it becomes too large scale.
Yeah. Okay, good stuff. And in terms of your sort of later life processes, how do you look to bring other professionals into the advice process?
I guess at every opportunity.
I suppose the obvious one's sort of solicitors, isn't it? Is that something you tend to?
Yeah. So being very picky and choosy about the solicitors that you use.
Yes.
We've got a huge advantage as financial planners in that we know our clients really well and we see them every single year, or often a lot more frequently than that. Whereas for solicitors, the nature of their work can be far more transactional, and they might go years without seeing their clients. So using that ability where we highlight needs and then making a positive referral to the right solicitor that you've vetted and chosen. So a classic one might be LPAs. You know, we have a tick box on our fact find that says, do you have an LPA? Yes. Asking a few extra questions. Do you have an LPA? Does it have appropriate supervision and safeguarding clauses in it? No. Well, then we're going to make a referral to have that reviewed by a solicitor that we know is competent and qualified in that specific area to deal with that. And that can help build, if you like, referral currency.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And how do you perceive other professions treat later life clients differently to perhaps financial planning?
Yeah, so I have noticed a difference in vulnerable client procedures in financial services compared to legal from a sort of compliance point of view. So in STEP, they talk very much about make sure you see the client on their own, you know, whereas you
What would be the reason for that?
Make sure that you are getting the client's true views.
Yeah.
You know, so if you're taking
Okay.
instruction for a will or a power of attorney, is it's making sure that the client is expressing their views rather than the views of somebody that is having some sort of undue influence over them or even coercive control.
Yeah.
So I guess it's slightly nuanced, but the focus is very much on make very, very good case notes. That's the same with us. But make sure you see the client on their own, whereas our focus tends to be make sure the client, there is a third party there with the client. And that's not to say that don't see them on their own, but it's sort of the focus is slightly different. And I guess the perception might be that the risk of harm, if you like, the solicitors, regulators are thinking the risk of harm is coming from somebody exercising undue influence over the client, and it's not likely to be the solicitor. Same risk of harm in financial services, but the regulator might be thinking, is it the financial advisor that's exerting undue influence here and doing what they want to do? And I guess that's a legacy of some of the stuff that's happened in the past in our industries, and not by us, but you know, by some of our more sales orientated
Very possibly,
colleagues in the past. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. No, that's really appreciated. Thanks for your time today, Seb.
Thank you, Colin. Pleasure.
Cheers.